Hi there, I'm Sarah Me, and today I'm going to be sewing just the inset of the Charlie Caftan by the newly named Closet Core Patterns, originally Closet Case Patterns. This pattern's been out for a bit, a lot of people still make it, and it's a pretty easy dress to sew once you get past this inset, and so I'm going to help you sew it, and it's going to be great. You can use this method for any of the views. I'm doing view B, which is the gathered inset with no waist ties. And if you are doing the pleated one or the waist ties, I'll kind of give you some tips on that. Just have your pleats all sewn, and then you can carry on when we get to the inset. So the pattern pieces that you're going to be using in this little section here, you're going to need your inset, which is also called the bodice panel. And you're going to need one that is interfaced. I actually used a fusible interfacing on this piece to keep it super stable since I'm using a really slinky rayon. And then an uninterfaced bodice panel as well. Then you need your front. This is my front right here, and you can see here's my seam down the center front, so make sure you have that seam sewn. And then we're going to mark our box right here on the wrong side of the fabric. There are dots on the pattern piece right about here and here on all four corners and on the inset, and you can use those as well. I like to just draw a box at that same point. It's 5/8 of an inch. I'm using a washable Crayola marker for this. Alright, so I'm just going to draw my box on here just at the ends. And I'm only going to do this on the dress. There we go. So now we're going to do it to the other side. You can try and sew this without this, but I do find this to be really helpful. Especially when you're starting to manage lots of things at once. When we get to that point, seeing the box is going to be reassuring, or in at least a target for where you need to pivot, because it's not going to be nice and flat like this while we're sewing it. It's going to be a little bit higgledy-piggledy. Alright, so you just want that box on the corners there, right here, just like that. And now we're going to sew those markings that we just did, and we're going to put in our gathering stitch across the bottom, and then we're going to be set to go. Are you ready? Okay, we're going to reinforce these corners here by sewing on that box we just created, and we're just going to sew at our regular stitch length. You just need a little bit of reinforcement there. Just do it just inside your seam allowance, and you want really crisp corners. So make sure when you get to your corner, sink your needle down, lift your presser foot up, and pivot. Do not lose it, because this is kind of the key to making this bodice panel look really nice, is having nice crisp corners. You don't need to back stitch or anything. And now we're going to do the other side. If you're finding that you might not nail it with your corner, you can use your hand wheel, just walk your needle, lift your presser foot, and kind of adjust it before you sink it down. Now pivot. Alright, and now we're going to add our gathering stitch, but before we do that, I think what's really helpful on this is having a center point. So hopefully we can find it amidst all the gathers, but it is really nice to have that so we can adjust our gathers evenly. So maybe make a little bit of a triangle notch there. You have plenty of seam allowance there. You have 5/8 of an inch. You're not going to hurt anything. And at least with a triangle, we can even make it a little sharper. It's very visible, whereas like a notch straight into the fabric is pretty hard to see. So there's a gigantic notch there, but we're going to be able to find it really easily. All right, so I'm going to put 2 rows of gathering stitch in just inside this seam line here. I'm not going to make my stitch length too much longer since it's a rayon. Rayon's pretty easy to gather, and I don't really want the gathers to be too bumpy. So I like to kind of keep my stitch a little bit shorter than the usual gathering stitch. All right, I'm going to go start just past the cutout of the box at the top and at the bottom. Not this stitching here, just ignore that. You want to go just past your cutout box and start just before your cutout box. You're going to do that just inside the seam allowance of the 5/8. And we're going to do 2 rows. 2 rows will make the gathers look really nice. I used to always cheat and only do one row of gathering stitches when it was required. And I learned that the gathering stitches just don't look as nice if you only do one row. They look a little bumpy, and sometimes they fold and land on top of each other when you go to sew it into the seam. And then that way you don't have nice crisp gathers. All right, so just keep sewing your gathering stitch. All right, so now we have our second row in. Make sure you leave yourself a tail. All right, and so now we're going to gather up these 2 rows. I'm going to start at one side and pull. We're going to evenly distribute this, and if you're using something kind of thready, a fabric that's kind of thready, try not to rub this raw edge here, and maybe it'll stay a little bit more tame. When fabrics don't have as much integrity, like something open weave or these rayons, and they get very frayed, it gets a little messy in there. So just try not to rub that edge while you're doing this. Just kind of slide your gathers along the threads. All right, so let's get a bunch in there, and then we can go to the other side here. You can always take some out, so if you overdo it, you can always slide some off. And we're going to distribute our gathers on there nicely. So now our check is if this opening now matches the length of this side here. So these should be parallel. We're making a nice box. So we need to pull up a little bit more. You want your gathers to go all the way to the corners here and be evenly distributed. And you can see those 2 rows make the gathers nice and straight. They line up a little bit better. All right, so let's see here. We can let out a few. I think this side has a little bit less. We have our center notch right there, so we know about what side needs less. All right, there we go. We have it ready. So get all these threads kind of pulled towards the raw edge, just like that. Make sure they're evenly distributed. You don't have them buckling on top of each other because they'll be a little bit squirrely to try and sew down if they're not. So let's get that nice and even. All right, so now we're going to put our bodice panel on, and I promise it's going to be pretty easy, but the next step is really crucial, so make sure you do it. Okay, so now we're going to put on our bodice panel, but the first thing we need to do is we need to cut into the corners of our dress here, right up to that box that we created. So that little stitch box there, you want to cut straight up there into that corner, get as close as possible without cutting through the thread. Doesn't matter if it's straight or not, the line, you just need to make sure that that corner has the cut into it. This is going to create a nice crisp cornered box when we go to sew this in. And it'll make it possible for us to even sew it. It frees up these 4 sides to create a seam allowance that we can actually lift up and sew. All right, so now we have our 4. Let's get our gathering threads out here. Can trim down a little bit of this mess here. So we have our 4 corners here, you see that? Now we have 4 seams that we can sew. All right, and so now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the centers of this bodice panel here, just so I have a little bit of a guide when I go to sew it in. So now I can have that center to there, this center to there. I know where my corners are, and it's going to make it a little easier. All right, so we're going to sew this on the dress side. So we're going to put, I'm actually going to sew this with from the top first. So we're going to put this right sides together, just like this. Put that bodice panel under there. And now lift up the skirt part of your dress and flip it over your hand, just like this. All right. Okay, and now we're going to line up that center seam to that center notch, just like that. And we're going to start sewing. If you want to pin this, you can, but it's really short seams, and I think you're going to find that you can do it without pins, but you may want a few just to kind of stabilize things. That's great. All right, so now remember you're maintaining that 5/8 inch seam allowance. You don't have to backstitch. All right, and so here's my box of the dress, right? So I'm going to straighten out the dress, kind of let it relax, and you can see I'm kind of creating the box. Remember, these are the corners that we cut into right here. I'm going to line up these raw edges. And the reason I do that is to really keep this relaxed so I can pivot on a dime right there in that corner, rather than starting to already turn the dress before I've got my needle in there. It helps to keep that corner nice and crisp, so I like to do it this way. So I keep my dress nice and relaxed. The dress has no idea I'm about to change its shape, so we're going to try and let it relax until we get there. All right, so now I'm getting to that box right there, and I'm going to sink my needle. I'm just outside of the stitching, that pre-stitching that we did, and we're going to sink our needle right into that corner. Needle down, and now you're going to pick up the dress. You're going to pivot the panel to the left and the dress to the left, like this. And we're going to line up now the short edges, that short little piece that looks just like this on this side. And the same thing, I'm going to try and keep the dress relaxed, but I'm going to try and line up this short little edge right there to the short side of the panel. I'm going to fuss with it a little bit. And so there we go. And now, more importantly, like if you came down that long side we just sewed and you are a little bit less than 5/8 of an inch seam allowance or more when you get to the end of your seam and you're pivoting, it doesn't matter where the panel's at. Just make sure you maintain your box and you keep it nice and square. So if the panel you use a little bit more of the seam allowance or a little less than the seam allowance, that's okay. Nobody's going to see that. They're really just going to see that rectangle that you're sewing right now. So that's all you need to worry about. And I'll explain this a little bit more in a second. All right, so now we're going to pivot. And the other thing you want to think about is this short little seam really should be parallel to the panel. So the panel is a nice rectangle, right? And so now we want to try and keep this short seam parallel, no matter what. So if this edge, this right here, if your panel is right here, like it only came to here when you should have 5/8 of an inch seam hanging off, that's okay. As long as you keep this short little panel seam parallel to the short seam, it's going to look good. All right, so pivot and sew down that seam. Sink your needle into that corner again, and same thing. We're going to pick up the dress. We're going to slide the panel to the right and the dress over. And now we're going to get to a point where now we have to kind of turn the dress inside out like this. Just like that. All right, and so we're still in that corner there. And now make sure none of this dress is sneaking into that seam. Pull your gathering stitches out towards the seam allowance, all these little threads. Put them in the seam allowance. Keep your edges raw right here. And we're still sewing just alongside that pre-sewn box we did right off the bat. We're going to get a couple inches here, and now we're going to look for our center. So where'd that center go? Here it is. It's very visible. Make sure the gathers are nice and even. And I like to kind of pull the dress like this a little bit to keep those gathers straight as they go into the seam. Because I know you've probably seen when your gathers get a little wonky in your skirt and they look like they're tucks instead of gathers. You know, we're going to try and prevent as much of that as possible by kind of straightening out the gathers, kind of like you're combing your hair. You're going to comb those gathers straight down. It'll make them look nicer and hang nicer. You've spent all this work on this panel and it's going to look great. All right, so now we're getting to our next corner. You're doing good. Now, if you're going to start running out of room to maneuver things, but that's okay. We're almost done, right? So now we have this next corner here. So we're going to put that corner right there. But we're more interested in keeping everything parallel. So we're keeping our raw edges lined up. And like I said, if this right here were coming like that far over, you know, you only have like 1/4 of an inch of your panel there, that's fine. As long as you have some seam allowance that's sewn to your panel, that's fine. And just make sure that this doesn't get rounded. You're keeping this little short seam here nice and parallel to this edge here. All right, so here we go. Keeping those gathers nice and straight. this, you're gonna sew this exactly the same for the pleat. You're just gonna not have those gathers to have to deal with. All right, and see, yeah, so I'm gonna pull my gathers up a little bit so I can get that in there a little better. So when your gathers start falling off, it will definitely make everything slide off and make your seam too long. All right, here we go. The gathers are always a little less when you get to the ends of your gathering stitches. All right, there's my corner right there. Pick up the presser foot, but leave the needle down and pivot. And remember, you're pulling this dress away from that seam so none of it gets caught in the corners. You kind of got to pull it away. And see, look, my little edge here is hanging off a little bit, but that's okay. I still have enough seam allowance there. All right, so we're last corner. Let's see if we can get this to be nice and relaxed again. Now I'm going to pivot my last time, just like this. And look at that, it's all lined up. Now make sure that I can feel a lot of dress in there. I want to pull it out of those corners. It's really hard to fix these corners once you've sewn them. It's kind of like a welt pocket. All right, so how'd you do? All right, so then here's our corners, and they'll look a little bunched up right now. Remember, we're gonna press them when they're right side out, so let's look everything over. Here's my inset, just like that. Not too bad, I actually did pretty good. A little bit of a rounded seam there, but all in all, that's pretty good. So let's look and see how I really did. All right, so get rid of the threads. Don't panic yet when you see your threads. So now these little puckers like that, that's going to be okay. See, because that right there is just folds from when the dress was being kind of bunched up and going under there. Got some threads we can deal with, but all in all, this looks actually pretty darn good. And those seam allowances of your bodice panel are going to get pushed towards the panel, and that's also going to give it a much nicer look. Once these seams right here are pressed like this, it looks a lot different. I'll show you how it looks. Kind of fills it up, fills out your corners, and it gives you that nice polished look. So don't think that yours doesn't look like everybody else's before you do that step. All right, so now we have one more step, and we're going to sew the lining in there, the little lining panel, just like this. And if you're going to hand sew the whole thing, you're going to iron down all 4 edges, and then you're going to place it over the inset in there, press your seam allowances towards it, and then hand sew it on there. I'm going to go to the iron, I'm going to press one long edge, and I'm going to machine sew mine on, so if you want to try that out, stick with me. All right, we have one last step if you want to machine sew the bodice panel to the dress. We can do 3 sides, and then you only have to hand stitch the bottom side. So I've pressed under one long edge, and that's going to be the side that we hand sew. So here we go. Here's the top of my caftan here, and here's my bodice panel, and I pick it up just like this, and we're going to put the right side of this to the right side of the panel that's in there, the wrong side of the dress. I'm going to flip it over just like this. So this is my gather side of my panel. This is my dress. I'm going to line this up to the inset. So now you're really just going to pay attention to following the seam on the inset underneath. I like to sew this from the dress side up because it's easier to keep the dress out of the way, and then I don't accidentally nick it or put another seam in it that's going to show on the right side. So we want to stitch solely on the inside of the seam allowance of what we've already sewn on here. So I'm going to line this fold up with that seam, this gather seam down here. I'm going to line up the inset with the other sides of it there. So just stay on the seam allowance of this inset. Don't try and sew exactly on the original seam line, because you may run into some issues where you'll accidentally get one tiny little fold of the dress into that seam, and then you're having to rip it out, and it can get a little dicey there. All right, so I overshot that. I'm going to pick up my needle. I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm going to watch what I'm doing this time. I'm going to pull the dress out of the way. I'm going to push it away from that and pull the panel toward me, just like this. And I keep all that out of the way. So just make sure you push it all out of the way. looking for that seam that I've already sewn so I can pivot right there, just like that. Line up these raw edges of the panel. Keep pulling this dress out of the way and under here. There can be very sneaky little things, especially on thinner fabrics, you just won't feel it. All right, so we're keeping those raw edges. I can feel the seam under there. I'm just gonna sew just to the right of it. All right, and look at my panel still lined up there. I'm looking at that seam, there it is right there, and I'm just sewing just to the right of it, staying inside the seam allowance. I'm getting to the corner again, but I don't have to nail it. I'm just staying on the seam allowance. It's gonna be okay. All right, we're gonna pick up this dress and pull it all out there. Keep the panel lined up with itself, with its mate. Pull the dress out of the corners there. Make sure that all of them are out. We're on our last little leg. I'm gonna sew just inside that seam allowance again. And I'm looking at this fold line here, and I'm gonna make sure that it's actually lined up with the bottom of this seam here. That's pretty good. All right, so there we go. So now we have our 3 sides like that. And see, there is our front dress. This is the gather. And so now I'm gonna clip these corners, but first I'm gonna check and make sure I didn't accidentally catch anything on this side here, because it gets really hard to fix it after this. All right, so it looks like we're good. So now we're gonna trim these corners right here. And you're gonna make sure you do not trim anything else but the corner of this little panel here. There we go, just trim the corner. Just reducing the bulk so that you can now turn it right side out so that it'll lay nice. Make sure you trim the seam that you just sewed to the seam that you just sewed, because it's outside the original seam. All right, so here's the panel. We're gonna flip it around just like that. And Caftan all nice and flat here, so you can see. Put that seam allowance right up there, and you can sit there and spend a little time, get these corners pretty flat, pretty poked out like that. Put that seam allowance up. Once you press this down and that up, then you can put a few pins in it and hand stitch it closed, just like that. And I would take your pins, once you've pinned it like this, it's nice and clean. Look at that, it looks really nice, doesn't it? I like to pinch it like this and then just hand sew in the seam allowance of that gathering seam and this little fold here. No one's gonna see this, so it's a good chance to, you know, practice your hand sewing. I'm really rubbish at it, so I do as minimal as possible. That's why I like to machine sew this part. And just make sure that when you go to do it, everything looks flat. Look at that. Once all that seam allowance is poked to the inside, it looks really nice. Such a beautiful pattern, such a comfy dress. All right, good job. I'm so glad that you're sewing the bodice panel with me. Thanks so much. If you ever want to join me live, please do so. I'm live on YouTube a few times a week, and I have other how-to videos. And check out my website for any of the patterns that I've made. Thanks a bunch. Bye.